The evening sky turned a deep orange as Officer Thomas Reed finished his coffee in the patrol car. He'd been working in Pinewood Heights for nearly 8 years now, and he took pride in knowing almost every street and every face in this quiet, wealthy neighborhood. Another quiet night, he mumbled to himself, tossing the empty cup into a small trash bag. Just as he was about to start his engine, something caught his eye. A man walking slowly down Maple Avenue, hands in the pockets of his dark hoodie, eyes scanning the houses. Reed narrowed his eyes. The man was well-dressed, expensive-looking sneakers, what appeared to be designer jeans under the hoodie. But something didn't sit right with the officer. This wasn't a neighborhood where people typically walked, especially not as evening approached. And in Reed's experience, the few black residents of Pinewood Heights didn't usually dress so casually when out in the neighborhood. Better check this out, Reed decided, slowly pulling his patrol car forward. The man in the hoodie didn't notice the police car at first. He was looking at his phone, then glancing up at house numbers. When the patrol car's lights flashed once, he stopped, turning with a look of surprise that quickly shifted to something else, a look Reed had seen many times before. A mixture of frustration and resignation. "Evening, sir," Reed called out, stepping from his vehicle. "Mind if I ask what brings you to this neighborhood tonight?" The man's shoulders tensed visibly, but his voice remained calm. "I'm just walking home, officer." Reed approached, keeping one hand resting near his belt. "Home? You live around here?" "Yes, just down the street," the man replied, pointing ahead. "I've been patrolling Pinewood for years now," Reed said, his tone becoming more official. "Don't think I've seen you before. Would you mind showing me some identification?" The man's expression tightened. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "I'm literally just walking home from the bus stop after work." A couple walking their dog on the other side of the street slowed down, watching the interaction. The woman pulled out her phone. "Sir, I'm just doing my job," Reed explained, his voice firm but not hostile. "This is a low-crime neighborhood because we stay vigilant. I need to see some ID, please." The man took a deep breath. "My wallet is in my backpack." "I'm going to reach for it now, okay?" Reed nodded, watching carefully as the man unzipped his backpack and removed a leather wallet. By now, another patrol car had pulled up, Officer Chris Bailey, Reed's usual backup. "Everything okay here, Tom?" Bailey called, stepping out. "Just a routine check," Reed responded, taking the offered driver's license. He looked down at the ID, then back up at the man, whose face remained composed, but whose eyes showed clear frustration. "Dr. Andrew Taylor," Reed read aloud. The address on the license matched a house just 2 blocks away, one of the largest homes in Pinewood Heights. Bailey moved closer, glancing at the ID. "Wait, Dr. Taylor? From Pinewood Memorial." The man nodded. "Head of cardiology. I moved here about 5 months ago." Reed felt the first twinge of unease. The couple with the dog had now crossed the street and were standing nearby, the woman still holding up her phone. 2 more residents had emerged from their homes, watching the scene unfold. "Officer," called one of them, an older man in a polo shirt, "is there a problem with Dr. Taylor?" Reed looked from the concerned neighbor to the ID in his hand, then back to Dr. Taylor's face. The doctor wasn't angry or threatening, just tired, as if this was a scene he'd experienced too many times before. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Reed said slowly, handing the ID back. "Has there?" Dr. Taylor asked quietly. "Or did you see a black man in a hoodie and make assumptions about whether I belonged here?" The question hung in the air between them as the evening grew darker around the gathering crowd. The small crowd of neighbors grew as the streetlights flickered on. Dr. Taylor stood perfectly still, his driver's license now back in his hand, his eyes fixed on Officer Reed's face. "I asked you a question, officer," Dr. Taylor said, his voice calm but firm. "Did you stop me because I'm a black man in a hoodie walking through this neighborhood?" Officer Bailey shifted uncomfortably, looking between his partner and Dr. Taylor. The woman with the phone was now openly recording, and several other residents had their phones out too. "Sir, we were just following standard procedure," Reed replied, his confidence wavering slightly. "We got reports of suspicious activity in the area recently." "What kind of suspicious activity?" asked Dr. Taylor, adjusting his backpack strap. "And what exactly made me look suspicious to you?" Reed didn't answer immediately. The truth was, they hadn't received any specific reports that day. An older woman stepped forward from the growing crowd. "Thomas Reed, I know your mother raised you better than this," she said sharply. Reed recognized her instantly, Mrs. Peterson, his former high school math teacher who'd lived in Pinewood for decades. "Dr. Taylor saved my husband's life last month with emergency surgery." The doctor nodded politely to Mrs. Peterson but kept his attention on the officers. "I've been stopped 3 times since moving here. Always different officers, always the same reason. Apparently, I look out of place." Officer Bailey stepped forward. "Dr. Taylor, on behalf of the department, I apologize for the inconvenience." "This isn't about inconvenience," Dr. Taylor interrupted, his composure finally showing cracks of frustration. "This is about dignity. About being able to walk home from work without being treated like a criminal." By now, at least 15 neighbors had gathered. A man in a business suit approached, his hand extended toward Dr. Taylor. "Andre, I was just about to call you about the charity gala next week," he said, deliberately ignoring the officers. "The hospital board can't make decisions without you there." Reed recognized the man, Richard Wom, who served on the city council. Wom turned to face Reed, his friendly expression hardening. "Officer, is there a reason you're harassing our most distinguished new resident?" The man who, by the way, performed life-saving surgery on our police chief's wife just last month. Reed felt his stomach sink. Chief Parker's wife had indeed undergone emergency heart surgery recently, and the whole department had sent flowers to her hospital room. "There's been a misunderstanding," Reed managed to say, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "No," Dr. Taylor said, shaking his head slowly. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was profiling, plain and simple." He gestured to the homes around them. "I saved for years to buy a house in this neighborhood because it's close to the hospital and has good schools. I shouldn't have to carry my medical credentials along with my ID just to walk down my own street." A young couple pushed through the crowd. The woman looked directly at Officer Reed. "We have a security camera that caught this whole interaction from the beginning," she said, holding up her phone. "Would you like to explain to everyone what suspicious activity you saw before approaching Dr. Taylor?" Reed looked at his partner, who was already backing toward their patrol car, clearly wanting no part of this escalating situation. The recording neighbors, the city councilman, the former teacher, all waiting for his answer. Reed began, but stopped when he saw a sleek black car pull up to the curb. A well-dressed older woman stepped out, her face immediately recognizable to everyone present, Mayor Patricia Williams. "I was on my way to a dinner when I got 3 different texts about this situation," she said, walking directly to Dr. Taylor. "Andre, are you all right?" Dr. Taylor nodded slightly. "I'm fine, Mayor Williams. Just another evening in Pinewood Heights." The mayor turned to face the officers, her expression severe. "Officer Reed, Officer Bailey, I believe we need to have a conversation about community policing. First thing tomorrow morning in my office." Reed felt every eye on him, the neighbors, his partner, and especially Dr. Taylor, who wasn't angry or shouting, but whose quiet dignity somehow made Reed feel smaller than any angry confrontation could have. The next morning, Officer Reed sat in the waiting area outside Mayor Williams' office, his uniform freshly pressed, but his face showing the effects of a sleepless night. Officer Bailey sat beside him, nervously checking his watch every few minutes. "You think they'll fire us?" Bailey whispered, glancing at the mayor's closed door. Reed shook his head. "I don't know. But that video's already got 50,000 views online." The door opened and Chief Parker appeared, his expression grim. "The mayor will see you now." Inside the office, Mayor Williams sat behind her desk, with Dr. Taylor seated in one of the chairs across from her. The doctor wore a crisp white lab coat over professional attire, quite different from his casual appearance the previous evening. "Officers," the mayor said evenly, "I believe you know Dr. Taylor. Not as a suspicious person walking through a neighborhood, but as the head of cardiology at our hospital." Reed felt his face grow warm. "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Taylor studied both officers. The anger from last night had faded, replaced with something that looked almost like tiredness. "Before we discuss what happens next," the mayor continued, I thought it might be valuable for you to understand exactly who you detained yesterday. She nodded to Dr. Taylor, who cleared his throat. I moved here from Boston 5 months ago. Before that, I was at Massachusetts General Hospital for 12 years. I've performed over 3,000 cardiac surgeries, published 64 research papers, and I currently serve on the National Board for Heart Health Education. He paused, then added, last month I performed emergency surgery on Mrs. Parker. He nodded toward the police chief. And next week, I'm starting a free clinic for underserved communities on the East Side. Chief Parker stepped forward. Dr. Taylor saved my wife's life. I've been trying to recruit him to our town for 3 years. The silence in the room felt heavy. Reed stared at his hands. I don't want anyone fired over this, Dr. Taylor said suddenly, surprising everyone. That doesn't solve the real problem. The mayor leaned forward. And what do you think the real problem is, Doctor? The problem is seeing a black man in a hoodie and automatically assuming he doesn't belong, Dr. Taylor replied simply. I've been dealing with this my entire life. As a medical student, as a doctor, as a homeowner. My degrees and titles don't protect me from those first assumptions. He turned to face Reed directly. Officer, may I ask you something? When you saw me walking yesterday, what was the first thought that went through your mind? Not what you'd say officially in a report, just your honest first thought. Reed swallowed hard. Everyone was watching him. I thought you didn't fit the neighborhood, he admitted quietly. You weren't dressed like most of the residents I know. And yes, honestly, there aren't many black residents in that area. Dr. Taylor nodded. Thank you for being honest. What do you suggest we do, Doctor? The mayor asked. I'd like to invite Officers Reed and Bailey to join me at the hospital today, Dr. Taylor said. I want them to see what I do, meet my patients. And afterward, maybe we can talk about how we see each other in this community. Chief Parker raised his eyebrows. That's very generous of you, Dr. Taylor. It's not about generosity, the doctor replied. It's about building understanding. I'm tired of being stopped, but I'm even more tired of thinking that nothing will ever change. Reed found his voice. I'd be grateful for the opportunity. 2 hours later, Reed and Bailey walked through the cardiac unit, following Dr. Taylor as he made his rounds. They watched as patients lit up at the sight of the doctor, as nurses and other staff greeted him with obvious respect. In one room, an elderly patient reached for Dr. Taylor's hand. This is the man who gave me 10 more years, he told the officers, his eyes filling with tears. 10 more years with my grandkids. Reed felt something shift inside him as he watched Dr. Taylor review charts, explain procedures to families, and lead his medical team, all with the same quiet dignity he'd shown on the street while being detained. You know, Bailey whispered as they observed a consultation, I never would have pictured him like this from seeing him in that hoodie. That's exactly the point, Reed replied, finally understanding what they were really there to learn. 3 days after the incident, Officer Reed sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone. The video had now been viewed over 2 million times. News stations had picked up the story, and Reed had received dozens of messages from old friends, some supportive, others disappointed. His daughter Lisa walked in and poured herself some juice. At 16, she had strong opinions about everything, and she hadn't spoken much to her father since the video went viral. You know, Dad, she finally said, breaking the silence, Dr. Taylor is coming to my school today to talk about medical careers. Reed looked up. He is? Lisa nodded. Everyone's talking about it, not just because of the video, but because he's like super impressive. Mia's mom had heart surgery last year, and she says Dr. Taylor is the only reason her mom is still alive. Reed felt the now familiar twist of shame in his stomach. Lisa, about what happened. You messed up, Dad, she said bluntly. But you know what's weird? Some of my friends are defending you, saying you were just doing your job. She leaned against the counter. But the black kids at school, they're not surprised at all. Tyler said his dad gets stopped all the time, and he's an accountant who wears suits every day. The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Reed opened the door to find Chief Parker standing there. Got a minute? The chief asked. They sat in Reed's living room, the chief declining coffee. The department's getting pressure to fire you, he said without preamble. The mayor's office has received over 500 calls. Reed nodded slowly. I understand. But, the chief continued, Dr. Taylor called me personally this morning. He doesn't want that to happen. Reed looked up, surprised. He doesn't. No. In fact, he suggested something else entirely. The chief handed Reed a folder. He's starting a community advisory board to work with the police department on improving relations, especially in minority communities. He wants you to be part of it. Reed opened the folder, scanning the proposal. Why would he want me involved? His exact words were, Officer Reed has an opportunity to learn and to teach. Sometimes the people who've made the mistake have the most powerful perspective to share. Later that afternoon, Reed found himself sitting in the back of the auditorium at Pinewood High School, watching as Dr. Taylor spoke to a rapt audience of teenagers. He talked about growing up with limited resources, about working multiple jobs to get through medical school, about the first time he saved someone's life. The heart doesn't care what color your skin is, Dr. Taylor told the students. Inside, we're all the same. But outside, that's where we still have work to do. After the presentation, students crowded around the doctor, asking questions. Reed noticed his daughter Lisa among them, her hand raised persistently until Dr. Taylor called on her. As the crowd thinned, Reed approached hesitantly. Dr. Taylor looked up and recognized him immediately. Officer Reed, he said, his tone neutral. I didn't expect to see you here. My daughter attends school here, Reed explained. And I wanted to thank you. The chief told me about the advisory board. Dr. Taylor studied him for a moment. You know, the easiest thing would be to villainize you, to demand your badge, to use this incident as proof that nothing ever changes. He gathered his papers. But the harder path, the one that might actually lead somewhere better, is to use this as a starting point. A local news crew that had been covering the school event approached them, camera rolling. Dr. Taylor, Officer Reed, can we get a statement about the incident? The reporter asked, thrusting a microphone forward. The two men looked at each other, both clearly uncomfortable with the attention. We're having a private conversation, Dr. Taylor said firmly to the reporter. But what I will say on camera is this. What happened the other night was wrong. It happens to black people every day. But condemning individuals without offering paths to growth doesn't create the change we need. He glanced at Reed. Officer Reed is here. He's listening. He's uncomfortable, and that discomfort is where growth starts. That's all I'll say for now. As the news crew reluctantly backed away, Reed felt a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. Thank you, he said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Dr. Taylor replied. The real work hasn't even started. The first meeting of the Community Advisory Board took place 2 weeks later in the library's community room. Reed arrived early, his stomach in knots. He'd been placed on desk duty since the incident, and some of his fellow officers had been keeping their distance. People began to filter in, community leaders, a few other police officers, several residents from different neighborhoods across town. Reed recognized Mr. Wong from the city council, Mrs. Peterson, his former teacher, and a few other faces from that night. Dr. Taylor was the last to arrive, walking in with purpose, shaking hands as he made his way to the front of the room. Thank you all for coming, Dr. Taylor began. I know some of you might be wondering why I wanted to create this group instead of just filing a complaint against Officer Reed. His eyes found Reed in the crowd. The truth is, I've been stopped by police 17 times in my life. 17 times when I wasn't speeding, wasn't breaking any laws, just existing in spaces where someone decided I didn't belong. A heavy silence fell over the room. If we got rid of every officer who ever made an assumption based on race, we'd have very few officers left, Dr. Taylor continued. But if we can change how officers think, how they approach situations, how they see the people in their community, then maybe we can make those 17 stops mean something. An older black man in the back stood up. I'm Ben Taylor, no relation to the good doctor here, he said with a small smile. I've lived in this town for 42 years. Been stopped more times than I can count. What makes you think anything will change now? Dr. Taylor nodded respectfully. A fair question, Mr. Taylor. I don't know that it will. But I do know that the video of what happened to me got people's attention in a way that statistics and reports never have. People in this town who never thought this happened here saw it with their own eyes. Reed found himself standing up. His heart was pounding, but he knew he needed to speak. "I've been a police officer for 8 years," he said, his voice unsteady at first. "I was taught to look for things that seem out of place, people who don't fit the pattern of a neighborhood." He paused, meeting Dr. Taylor's gaze. "But I never stopped to think about what that really means. Who gets to decide what fitting in looks like?" Mrs. Peterson leaned forward. "Thomas Reed, I taught you algebra 15 years ago. You were always a good kid with a good heart. But good intentions aren't enough when the system you're working in has problems baked into it." The conversation flowed more freely after that, sometimes heated, sometimes emotional. People shared stories Reed had never heard before. The black business owner who had the police called on him while showing a property he owned, the teenager who was followed around in stores, the woman who had neighbors question whether she was a resident or a cleaner. Near the end of the meeting, Dr. Taylor proposed something unexpected. "Officer Reed," he said, "would you be willing to share your perspective on what happened that night? What was going through your mind? No judgment, just honest reflection." Reed felt every eye in the room turn to him. His instinct was to defend himself, to minimize what had happened. But something stopped him. "I saw you," he said slowly, "and I made assumptions based on how you looked. Not just that you were black, but that you were wearing casual clothes in an upscale neighborhood. I told myself I was doing my job, following training. But the truth is, if you'd been white, I probably wouldn't have stopped you at all." The admission hung in the air. Some people nodded, others looked uncomfortable. "That's where we start," Dr. Taylor said quietly. "With honesty." As the meeting wrapped up, people broke into smaller groups, talking, exchanging contact information. Reed found himself approached by Ben Taylor, the older man who had spoken earlier. "Takes guts to say what you said," the older man told him. "My grandson wants to be a police officer someday. Maybe by the time he joins up, things will be different." Reed looked at him, surprised. "I hope so, sir." "Hope's not enough," Ben replied, not unkindly. "But it's a start. See you at the next meeting, officer." The advisory board had been meeting monthly for nearly half a year. What had started as tense, awkward gatherings had slowly evolved into something more productive. Real changes were beginning to take shape in the police department: new training programs, community outreach efforts, and revised protocols for pedestrian stops. Reed had become one of the most active members, often staying late after meetings to continue conversations. After that first difficult admission, something had shifted in him. The defensiveness had faded, replaced by a genuine desire to understand and to help other officers understand too. One evening after a particularly productive meeting, Dr. Taylor approached Reed as he was gathering his notes. "Officer Reed, do you have a minute? I'd like to show you something." They walked together to Dr. Taylor's car. The doctor opened his trunk and pulled out a worn shoebox. "Let's sit over there," he said, nodding toward a bench outside the library. The evening was cool and pleasant. Streetlights had just come on, casting a soft glow over the nearly empty parking lot. Dr. Taylor opened the box and pulled out what looked like old photographs. "These are from my childhood," he explained, handing one to Reed. "That's me at 10 years old. My mom was a nurse's aide. Dad drove a delivery truck. They worked so hard to move us to a better neighborhood with better schools." Reed looked at the photo of a skinny boy with a bright smile standing proudly in front of a modest house. 2 weeks after we moved in," Dr. Taylor continued, "I was riding my new bike around the neighborhood when a police officer stopped me. Asked me whose bike I was riding. Asked me what I was doing in that neighborhood." He paused. "I was 10 years old." Reed handed the photo back carefully. "I'm sorry that happened to you. It was the first time, but not the last." Dr. Taylor pulled out another photo, himself as a teenager in a graduation gown. High school valedictorian. Got stopped walking home from the ceremony still wearing this gown. The officer asked if I'd stolen it. Reed felt that familiar twist of shame in his stomach. "How did you not just give up? Get bitter?" Dr. Taylor smiled slightly. "Who says I didn't? I went through times of anger so deep I couldn't see straight. Times when I wanted to give up." He pulled out another photo, himself in a white coat, receiving some kind of award. "My medical school graduation. My parents were so proud." He looked directly at Reed. "But here's the thing. I realized that success wasn't enough. Moving to the right neighborhood, wearing the right clothes, driving the right car, none of it protects you completely. So I had a choice: stay angry or try to change things. Reed nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that a lot, about how to help change things from the inside. That's why I wanted to talk to you tonight, Dr. Taylor said. The department is planning a new training program on bias awareness. Chief Parker mentioned they're looking for officers to help lead it. Reed looked surprised. And you think I should volunteer? I think you have a perspective now that most officers don't. You've seen both sides of this, making assumptions based on appearance, and then having to confront what those assumptions really mean. They sat in silence for a moment, watching as a young family walked by, children laughing and running ahead of their parents. My daughter Lisa told me something interesting last week, Reed said finally. She said that before all this happened, she never really thought about these issues. But now she's paying attention, noticing things. He shook his head. She called me out the other day when I made an assumption about someone. Dr. Taylor laughed. Teenagers can be our best teachers sometimes. She also said she's thinking about becoming a doctor because of your talk at her school. Reed added, she used to want to be a police officer like me. The world needs good police officers as much as it needs doctors, Dr. Taylor replied. Maybe she'll find a way to be both, to heal and to protect. As they stood to leave, Reed extended his hand. I'll talk to the chief about the training program. If you think I can help, I want to try. Dr. Taylor shook his hand firmly. That's all any of us can do, Officer Reed, trying to make things better than we found them. 1 year to the day after Officer Reed stopped Dr. Taylor on that quiet neighborhood street, the community gathered in the park for the opening of a new youth center. The building, once an abandoned recreation facility, now gleamed with fresh paint and new windows. Reed stood at the back of the crowd, watching as Mayor Williams cut the ceremonial ribbon. Beside her stood Dr. Taylor, who had not only contributed significantly to the funding, but had also helped design the health clinic inside the center. And now, the mayor announced, I'd like to invite Officer Thomas Reed to say a few words. A murmur went through the crowd as Reed made his way to the front. Some people knew him from the viral video. Others knew him from the community programs he'd helped develop over the past year. He took a deep breath as he faced the gathered residents. A year ago, I made a mistake that changed my life, Reed began, his voice steady despite his nerves. I stopped a man for walking in his own neighborhood because I decided he didn't belong there. That man was Dr. Andrew Taylor, who's standing here today. He glanced at Dr. Taylor, who gave him an encouraging nod. What could have ended with anger and division instead became something else entirely. Dr. Taylor chose to use that moment to start a conversation, a difficult, uncomfortable conversation that our community needed to have. Reed looked out at the crowd, recognizing many faces, fellow officers who had gone through the new training program he helped develop, community members who had shared their stories at advisory board meetings, teenagers who would use this new center. In the past year, our police department has changed how we approach our work. Stops are down by 40%, while positive community interactions are up. More importantly, officers are building real relationships with the people we serve. He gestured to the new building behind him. This youth center represents what can happen when we see each other as neighbors instead of strangers, when we work together instead of against each other. As Reed returned to his place in the crowd, Dr. Taylor took the microphone. Officer Reed didn't mention that he's volunteered over 200 hours to make this center a reality, Dr. Taylor told the crowd. He's also personally mentored 15 young people, teaching them about both their rights and their responsibilities when interacting with law enforcement. After the ceremony, people mingled in the new center, exploring the recreation rooms, computer lab, and health clinic. Reed found himself approached by Ben Taylor, the older man from the first advisory board meeting. Brought my grandson to see this place, Ben said, nodding toward a teenage boy checking out the basketball court. He still wants to be a police officer. Now I'm not so worried about that idea. Reed smiled. We'd be lucky to have him. The department's changing. Because people like you are willing to change first, Ben replied. That's not small. Across the room, Reed spotted his daughter Lisa deep in conversation with Dr. Taylor. She had started volunteering at the hospital, shadowing different medical departments. Now she was gesturing excitedly about something while the doctor listened intently. Reed felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to find Chief Parker. "That training program you developed has caught attention from other departments," the chief said. "State's attorney wants us to roll it out countywide. You up for that?" Before Reed could answer, a small commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. A news crew had arrived to cover the opening. "Officer Reed," the reporter called out, recognizing him. "You were in that viral video last year. How did you end up working with Dr. Taylor on this center?" Reed looked around. At Dr. Taylor still talking with his daughter, at Ben and his grandson shooting hoops, at the diverse crowd of community members and police officers mingling comfortably. "It's a long story," Reed told the reporter with a smile. "But the short version is pretty simple. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes if you're willing to learn and grow from them." Dr. Taylor joined them, placing a friendly hand on Reed's shoulder. "And if you're willing to see people for who they really are," he added, "not just who you assume them to be at first glance."